She lied to the Billionaire CEO about their baby, but the truth came out at the hospital. "I'm her emergency contact." Those 4 words echoed through the sterile hallway of Meridian General Hospital like a gunshot, and Isolde Brennan's world tilted sideways, because the man saying them, the man now standing in the doorway with disheveled hair and determination carved into every line of his face, wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to know. He wasn't supposed to exist in this moment at all. But to understand how 4 simple words could shatter an 8-month fortress of carefully constructed lies, to the moment when Isolde sat alone in that same hospital just 3 days earlier, clutching the edge of an examination table while her entire body betrayed her. The rain had been hammering against the windows that afternoon, with a fury that matched the storm raging inside Isolde's chest. Her knuckles were white against the sterile paper beneath her palms, and the fluorescent lights above hummed their cold, indifferent song while Dr. Yashira made notations on a tablet, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes betraying something that looked dangerously close to concern. "Miss Brennan," the doctor had said, her voice gentle but firm in that way doctors have when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. "I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, and with your history of preeclampsia, we're looking at a high-risk scenario. The baby's heartbeat shows signs of distress." Isolde's breath had caught in her throat. The baby. Their baby. The child she'd spent 8 months protecting with a fortress of lies. A castle built on the foundation of a single, desperate deception that had seemed so right at the time, and now felt like it was crushing the air from her lungs. She pressed her hand against her swollen abdomen, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her palm, a reminder that this wasn't just her life hanging in the balance anymore, and maybe it never had been. "Does anyone know you're here?" Dr. Yashira had asked, glancing at the empty chair beside the examination table with the kind of pointed look that said she already knew the answer. "The father? Family?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Isolde's throat had constricted because how could she possibly explain that the father believed this child didn't exist? That he thought their brief, passionate entanglement had ended with nothing more than bittersweet memories and a clean break? That she'd looked him in the eyes through a video call screen 7 months ago and told him the pregnancy test was negative, watching relief wash over his handsome features before he flew to Singapore to close the deal that would make him one of the youngest billionaires in the tech industry? "There's no one," Isolde had whispered, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue, and it was just one more lie in a tower of them, each one stacked carefully on top of the last, until she could barely see the ground anymore. You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of a decision that will change everything, and you can feel the weight of it pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe? That's where Isolde had been for 8 months straight, every single day, carrying the weight of a secret that grew heavier with each passing week, with each doctor's appointment attended alone, with each ultrasound image tucked into a drawer where no one else would ever see it. Dr. Yashira had studied her with those knowing eyes, the kind that had probably seen 1,000 variations of this exact situation, 1,000 women sitting alone in examination rooms with secrets written across their faces in invisible ink. "Miss Brennan, Isolde," the doctor had said, her voice softening with something that looked dangerously close to pity. "I'm going to be frank with you. If your condition deteriorates further, we may need to perform an emergency delivery. You're only 32 weeks along. The baby would need intensive care, and you would need support, please. If there's anyone you can call, anyone at all, who should know about this situation." But Isolde had just shaken her head, accepting the prescription for bed rest with trembling hands, knowing she wouldn't call anyone because calling meant explaining, and explaining meant unraveling the intricate web she'd woven to protect not just herself, but him. Dashiell Kavanaugh. Even thinking his name sent a cascade of emotions through her body like electricity, longing and regret, and a love so profound it terrified her, a love that had been the reason for the lie in the first place. As she'd left the hospital that afternoon, prescription clutched in her hand like a lifeline that couldn't actually save her, Isolde's mind had drifted back to where it always drifted when she was alone, to the beginning, to the night when everything had started with a glance across a crowded room and the kind of connection that only happens once in a lifetime, if you're lucky. Before this story breaks your heart, pause for just a moment. Ask yourself, what lie are you living to protect someone you love? What truth are you holding back because you're convinced that silence is safer than honesty, that protection is the same as love? And if you believe that truth, no matter how painful, is always worth it, then you need to hear how this story ends, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we really are. They hold up mirrors to the decisions we make, when we're terrified and alone, and convinced we're doing the right thing, even when everything inside us is screaming that we're not. 9 months earlier, Isolde had been standing in the converted warehouse in Brooklyn that served as home to the most eclectic community theater troupe in the city, adjusting the final touches on a costume she'd spent 3 weeks creating for an obscure Czech play that maybe 50 people total would come to see. It was intermission, and the cramped lobby was packed with a kind of bohemian crowd that thrived in spaces like this. People in thrifted vintage and artistic black, people who measured success in passion projects and creative fulfillment rather than quarterly earnings reports. And then she'd seen him. He'd been standing near the makeshift refreshment table, looking magnificently out of place in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his dark hair perfectly styled, his posture screaming boardroom confidence, even as his eyes scanned the crowd with barely concealed discomfort. Their eyes had met across the room, and something electric had passed between them, recognition without prior meeting, connection without words. The kind of moment that people write songs about and make movies about because it's so rare and so powerful that it feels almost supernatural when it happens. Isolde had approached him with uncharacteristic boldness, her usual shyness evaporating in the face of that magnetic pull. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she'd said, and he'd turned to face her fully, and his smile had transformed his entire face from intimidating to disarming in the space of a heartbeat. "Is it that obvious?" he'd replied, and there was warmth in his voice, amusement dancing in his amber eyes. "My sister would kill me if she knew. She's in the cast, dragged me here, straight from a board meeting." He gestured ruefully at his suit, at the way he stood out, like a peacock in a room full of sparrows. "Your secret's safe with me," Isolde had said, extending her hand. "I'm Isolde." Dashiell. His hand had been warm, his grip firm, and the touch had sent electricity racing up her arm. "And actually, now that you're here, I'm exactly where I want to be." The line should have been cheesy, should have made her roll her eyes and walk away. But instead, it had stolen her breath, and she'd found herself smiling like a teenager with her first crush. What followed was 3 months of the most intoxicating romance Isolde had ever experienced. 3 months that felt like living inside a dream, where reality kept shifting and reshaping itself into something more beautiful than she'd ever imagined possible. Dashiell was brilliant and driven, a tech entrepreneur in the middle of securing international funding for a revolutionary AI platform that would change everything about data security and cloud computing. And he talked about algorithms and venture capital with the same passion that Isolde talked about fabric textures and period-accurate buttonholes. He took her to hole-in-the-wall restaurants where the owners knew him by name, and to rooftop gardens where the city spread out below them like a constellation of possibilities. They went to gallery openings and late-night diners, had conversations that lasted until dawn, discovered that they both loved obscure jazz music and hated romantic comedies, and believed that the best pizza in New York wasn't in Manhattan at all, but in a tiny place in Queens that didn't even have a sign. But even as Isolde fell deeper and deeper in love, even as she memorized the way Dashiell's face looked in morning light and the sound of his laugh and the feel of his hands in her hair, there was always an expiration date hovering over them, unspoken but present, a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. Dashiell's life was airports and conference rooms, venture capital pitches in London and Tokyo and Singapore, hostile takeover negotiations, and emergency board meetings that started at midnight and ended at dawn. Isolde's life was fabric swatches and sewing machines, community theater productions, and a rent-controlled apartment she shared with 2 roommates where the heat only worked half the time and the hot water was a luxury you couldn't count on. They existed in different stratospheres, and both of them knew it, even if neither of them wanted to say it out loud. The end had come not with drama, but with devastating gentleness, and somehow that had made it worse. Dashiell had to leave for Singapore for 6 months, maybe longer, to personally oversee the final negotiations for the deal that would either make his company a global powerhouse or sink it completely. The opportunity was too significant to pass up, too rare to let slip through his fingers because of something as inconvenient as being in love. They'd been sitting in Isolde's tiny kitchen, the morning light painting gold across his features, and he'd been holding her hands like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Come with me," he'd said suddenly, desperately, the words tumbling out like he hadn't planned to say them but couldn't hold them back anymore. "I know it's insane, I know we've only known each other for 3 months, but come with me to Singapore. We'll figure it out. I'll support your work. You can design costumes for theaters there, or just focus on your own projects without worrying about rent or bills or anything except your art. Just come with me." And God, how Isolde had wanted to say yes. The word had been right there on her tongue, ready to spill out, ready to change everything. But then she'd thought about her mother, about watching her follow Isolde's father from city to city, country to country, abandoning career opportunities and personal dreams in service of someone else's ambitions. She'd watched her mother become a ghost of herself, resentful and lost, watching her own dreams fade like watercolors in the rain. Isolde had promised herself she'd never do the same, never become someone who existed only in the orbit of another person's ambitions, no matter how much she loved them. "I can't," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face, and the words had felt like glass cutting her throat. "Dashiell, I can't." He'd understood, even as it broke something fundamental in both of them, even as she watched the light dim in his eyes, and felt her own heart cracking down the middle. They'd spent their last night together tangled in her sheets, memorizing each other's bodies with desperate hands, whispering promises they both knew they couldn't keep, trying to capture something that was already slipping through their fingers like smoke. 2 weeks after he left, Isolde had missed her period. Another week, and the pregnancy test had shown 2 pink lines that altered the trajectory of her entire life in the time it took for the chemicals to react and the color to bloom across that tiny window. She'd stared at that test for hours, mind racing through possibilities and consequences, through what-ifs and maybes and the terrible weight of a choice she hadn't expected to have to make. She could tell him. She should tell him. But Dashiell was in the middle of the most important negotiations of his career. The deal that would cement his place in the tech world's upper echelon, that would turn his startup into a global empire. What would it do to him to know she was pregnant? Would he abandon the opportunity that meant everything to him? The dream he'd been building since he was 23 years old? Would he resent her, and the child, for derailing his carefully constructed future? Or worse, and this thought had haunted her in the dark hours of the night when she couldn't sleep, would he offer to help out of obligation, sending monthly checks while building his empire an ocean away, their child becoming an afterthought in his extraordinary life, a line item in his budget, a responsibility he fulfilled without joy, or presence, or love? The thought had made her physically ill, had sent her rushing to the bathroom to vomit, and she hadn't known if it was morning sickness or the crushing weight of imagining her child growing up feeling like a burden rather than a blessing. When Dashiell had video called her 3 days later, his face filling her laptop screen with exhausted exhilaration, telling her about a breakthrough in negotiations, about how everything was finally coming together, Isolde had made the decision that would haunt her for months to come. "I need to tell you something," she'd said, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it through the computer speakers, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her desk. "I took a pregnancy test." She'd watched his face go pale, watched the fear flash across his features before he could mask it, watched him transform from the man she loved into someone calculating consequences and measuring costs. And? His voice had been carefully neutral, controlled in that way he got during business negotiations, and hearing that tone directed at her had felt like being stabbed. It was negative. She'd lied, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat, cutting her from the inside out. "I just thought you should know, in case you'd been worried." The relief that had flooded his expression had been unmistakable, had confirmed every terrible fear she'd been carrying, and she'd known in that moment that she'd made the right choice, even as it destroyed her. "Thank God," he'd breathed, and then caught himself, tried to backtrack. "Not that I wouldn't. I mean, if it had been positive, we would have figured it out," but his words had trailed off into awkward silence, and Isolde had forced herself to smile. "I know," she'd interrupted gently, saving him from having to finish the thought. "It's okay, Dashiell. We both have lives to build." They'd ended the call shortly after, and Isolde had quietly ended their remaining contact in the weeks that followed, responding to his messages with increasing distance, claiming she was busy with a major theater project that was consuming all her time and energy. Eventually his messages had slowed, then stopped, and she told herself it was cleaner that way, told herself she was protecting both of them from a situation that would have made everyone miserable. Right here, in this moment, everything changed. Would you have told him the truth? Would you have called him back across an ocean and told him that his life was about to become infinitely more complicated? That the clean break you'd made was actually the beginning of something permanent and binding and terrifying? Comment below what you'd do. Because walking away from love doesn't always mean it's over. Sometimes it's where the real story begins. Sometimes it's where we discover who we really are, when we're stripped of all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about protection and sacrifice, and doing what's best for everyone involved. But as the months passed and Isolda's body changed, as she felt the first flutters of movement like butterfly wings against the inside of her belly, and then the strong, insistent kicks that woke her in the night, as she decorated a tiny nursery in the corner of her bedroom and attended prenatal appointments alone in waiting rooms full of couples, she began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The lie had seemed so clear at first, so obviously the right choice, but now it felt like it was eating her alive from the inside out, growing heavier with each passing week until she could barely carry the weight of it. She'd go to her appointments and sit in the waiting room, watching expectant fathers with their hands on their partners' bellies, watching them lean close to whisper to the babies they couldn't wait to meet, and something inside her would crack a little more each time. At night, alone in her apartment, with her roommates' voices filtering through thin walls, she'd press her hands against her growing belly and try to imagine what she'd tell this child someday about their father. Would she lie and say he'd abandoned them? Would she tell the truth and admit she'd kept them a secret? Either option felt impossible, felt like betrayal. Felt like setting her child up for a lifetime of questions she didn't know how to answer. Her best friend Rue had been her lifeline, showing up with takeout and understanding, sitting with her through the worst of the morning sickness and the endless exhaustion, helping her assemble the second-hand crib she'd found on Craigslist, and painting the nursery walls a soft yellow because they didn't know if the baby was a boy or a girl, and yellow felt hopeful somehow, felt like sunshine and new beginnings. Rue had been the one person Isolde had told the truth to. The one person who knew that the father wasn't some random fling who'd disappeared but Dashiell Kavanaugh, whose name was now appearing in tech news with increasing frequency as his Singapore deal progressed from negotiation to reality. You should tell him, Rue had said more than once, gently, without judgment, while folding tiny baby clothes that looked impossibly small. He's old. He deserves to know. The baby deserves to have a father. But Isolde had shaken her head each time, clutching a onesie with little elephants on it, feeling her throat tighten with unshed tears. He'll think I'm trying to trap him, she'd whispered. He'll think I lied about the test being negative to manipulate him into coming back. And even if he doesn't think that, he'll come back out of obligation. And I can't, Rue. I can't watch him resent this baby, resent me. Can't watch him sacrifice everything he's worked for because of one night, and a broken condom, and a decision I made without him. The isolation had been the worst part, the crushing loneliness of carrying a secret that grew more visible every day. Isolde had stopped going to theater productions, stopped seeing friends who didn't know she was pregnant, created an elaborate web of excuses and half-truths to explain why she was always busy, always tired, always declining invitations. She'd kept working her marketing job as long as she could, wearing increasingly baggy clothes, angling her body at her desk so her growing belly wasn't obvious, taking her lunch breaks alone in her car where she could finally breathe and press her hands against the baby and whisper apologies for the circumstances of their arrival. And then, at 32 weeks, Dr. Yashira had delivered the news that made Isolde's carefully constructed world tilt sideways. High-risk pregnancy, dangerously elevated blood pressure, signs of preeclampsia, the possibility of emergency delivery, the baby showing signs of distress. All the things she'd been trying to avoid by staying quiet and handling everything herself had crashed down around her anyway, and suddenly she was facing the very real possibility that something could go wrong, that she might need help she'd systematically cut herself off from, that her pride and her fear and her desperate need to protect everyone from the truth might cost her and her baby everything. If you've ever tried to convince yourself that pain was protection, that suffering in silence was somehow noble or right, you know exactly how Isolde felt in that moment. Subscribe now, because every week we tell stories that remind you that love and fear can't live in the same heart, that the lies we tell to keep people safe often end up hurting them more than the truth ever could. And if you disagree, comment why, because maybe your perspective is exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Isolde had stepped off the subway that evening, prescription for bed rest clutched in her trembling hand, feeling the weight of 8 months of choices pressing down on her shoulders until she could barely stand upright. The October air was crisp against her face, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace, and her phone had buzzed in her pocket with a text from Rue. Gallery opening tonight. The message read, "You coming? It's supposed to be amazing, that new artist from the theater scene." Isolde had started to type a polite decline, her fingers moving automatically to create another excuse, another lie to add to the tower of them. But then something had made her pause, had made her read the message again more carefully. Gallery opening, theater scene. And suddenly, she'd remembered something Dashiell's sister had mentioned in passing 9 months ago, during that first night at the Warehouse Theater, about how she was transitioning from acting to visual arts, about how she had a show coming up in the fall. This gallery opening, could it possibly be hers? The thought had sent adrenaline coursing through Isolde's body, had made her hand shake so badly she'd almost dropped her phone. She'd told herself it was just curiosity, just a desire to support the arts community and get out of her apartment for a few hours before she went on bed rest and became a prisoner of her own body's limitations. But as she'd found herself changing direction, heading toward the address Rue had sent instead of home, as she'd stopped in a coffee shop bathroom to apply lipstick with trembling hands and pull on the flowing dress that almost disguised her pregnant belly, she'd known she was lying to herself one more time. She wanted to see him, needed to see him, needed to know if he was back in the States, if he was happy, if the Singapore deal had given him everything he'd sacrificed their relationship to achieve. The gallery had been packed with Brooklyn's artistic elite, champagne flowing and voices rising in enthusiastic conversation about brushstrokes and color theory and the emotional resonance of abstract expressionism. Isolde had accepted sparkling water from a server, her hand instinctively going to her belly in that protective gesture she couldn't quite break herself of, and she'd begun examining the paintings on the walls. They were bold abstract pieces that spoke of transformation and rebirth, all swirling colors and violent beauty. And something about them had made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. Isolde? The voice had frozen her in place, had turned her blood to ice and fire simultaneously, had made the entire crowded gallery fade away until there was nothing but that voice, that name spoken in that specific way, that only one person in the entire world could manage. She'd turned slowly, knowing what she'd see but not prepared for the actual reality of it, and there he was. Dashiell Kavanaugh, even more devastatingly handsome than she remembered, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, his dark hair slightly longer now, touching his collar in a way that made her fingers ache to touch it. His amber eyes were fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her knees weak, made her remember every touch, every kiss, every whispered word from those 3 perfect months a lifetime ago. Dashiell, she'd managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and she'd watched his gaze rake over her body, and seen the exact moment he registered her condition. His expression had shifted from pleased surprise to confusion to something she couldn't quite identify, something that looked like pain and longing and 1,000 questions all at once. "I didn't know you were back in the States." It was a stupid thing to say, inane small talk when there was so much unsaid hanging between them like a wall of glass. 2 months ago, he'd replied, his voice strange, controlled in that way that meant he was feeling things he didn't want to show. The Singapore deal closed successfully. His eyes had dropped to her belly again, and she'd seen him calculating, doing the math, trying to figure out if the timing could possibly line up with their last night together 9 months ago. "Isolde, are you—" Dashiell. A stunning woman in a red dress had materialized beside him, threading her arm through his with casual intimacy that had made something shrivel inside Isolde's chest. Of course he'd moved on. Of course there was someone else. What had she expected? That he'd spend 8 months pining for her while building his empire? "There you are," the woman had continued, smiling at Dashiell with obvious affection. "The curator wants to introduce you to someone important, someone who might be interested in investing in your sister's next show. This is Vivienne." Dashiell had said, his voice still strange, still off somehow. My business partner's wife, Vivienne. This is Isolde Brennan. An old friend. Friend. The word had hurt more than it should have. Had felt like being erased. Like those 3 months of the most intense love she'd ever experienced had been reduced to casual acquaintance status. Filed away under people he used to know. Lovely to meet you, Vivienne had said warmly, and there'd been no malice in her voice, no territorial claiming, just genuine friendliness that had somehow made it worse. Then she'd lowered her voice conspiratorially, gesturing at Isolde's belly. When are you due? You're absolutely glowing. That whole pregnancy glow thing is real, apparently. 6 weeks, Isolde had heard herself say. The lie coming automatically now. A reflex. Give or take. She'd been 32 weeks, which meant 8 weeks until due date. But lying had become such second nature that the words had slipped out before she could stop them, before she could calculate whether the timing would give away the truth she'd been protecting. How wonderful, Vivienne had exclaimed, and she'd looked around the crowded gallery expectantly. And is your partner here? I'd love to meet them. No, Isolde's voice had cracked, and she'd forced herself to steady it, to get the words out past the lump in her throat. He's not in the picture. The words had come out clipped, defensive, and she'd seen Dashiell's expression go completely unreadable, that mask he wore during high-stakes negotiations sliding into place. Could we talk? He'd asked quietly, and it wasn't really a question. Privately? Isolde had wanted to refuse, wanted to flee, wanted to protect herself from whatever was about to happen, but her body had betrayed her by nodding. Dashiell had excused them from Vivienne and guided Isolde through the crowd with a hand at the small of her back that sent electricity racing up her spine, that made her remember 1,000 other times he'd touched her there, proprietary and tender and completely natural, like her body was territory he knew by heart. They'd ended up in a quieter corner near the restrooms, away from the main crowd, and Dashiell had turned to face her with an expression she couldn't read. Is it mine? The question was direct, almost harsh, cutting through all the small talk and pleasantries straight to the heart of what he needed to know. Isolde's first instinct was to lie again, to protect them both from the complications of truth, to maintain the wall she'd built so carefully over 8 months of solitude. But she was so tired. Tired of carrying this alone. Tired of the fear. Tired of the deception that was eating her alive from the inside out. No, she'd said, and the lie had tasted bitter but familiar. Like a poison she'd been taking in small doses for so long she'd forgotten what clean air tasted like. You remember. The test was negative. But even as the words left her mouth, she'd known it was a mistake. Had seen the doubt in his eyes, the way he was calculating dates and timelines and probabilities. That was 8 months ago, Isolde. His voice was gentle but insistent, like he was trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. This baby, if you're 6 weeks from due date, you're about 34 weeks pregnant now. The timing. He trailed off, but the implication hung between them, heavy and undeniable. 8 months since she'd told him the test was negative, 34 weeks pregnant. The math didn't work if her lie had been true. I met someone after you left, she'd interrupted, the fabrication flowing with practiced ease now. Another lie to patch the holes in the first lie. A structure built entirely of deception that was on the verge of collapsing under its own weight. It was brief. He's not involved. The words had felt hollow, had sounded hollow, and she'd forced herself to meet Dashiell's eyes without flinching, to sell the lie with every ounce of acting ability she possessed. Dashiell had studied her face for a long moment, and she'd felt like he was seeing straight through her, like all her carefully constructed walls were transparent to him. But finally he'd seemed to accept it, though something in his expression had remained troubled, unconvinced. Are you okay? He'd asked, and the concern in his voice had nearly undone her completely. Financially? Emotionally? Do you need anything? Because, Isolde, even if it's not mine, he'd stopped, seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say. I still care about you. I never stopped caring about you. His words had been her undoing. The kindness, the concern, the evidence that he still felt something for her even after months of silence, it had all been too much, had made her realize what she'd given up, what she'd sacrificed on the altar of pride and fear and terrible, misguided protection. I'm fine, she'd managed, her voice breaking on the words. Really, I should go. It's been a long day. She hadn't waited for his response. had just turned and navigated through the crowd as quickly as her ungainly body would allow, needing to get out, to breathe, to escape, before she broke down completely and told him everything. Outside, the cool evening air had hit her face like a slap, and she'd realized she was crying, tears streaming down her cheeks unchecked. She'd just burned her last bridge, had lied to his face one more time, had watched concern and care, and something that might have been lingering love in his eyes, and had thrown it all away to protect a fiction she'd created to protect him from a truth he might have actually wanted. And in 3 days, that bridge she'd just burned would become her only lifeline, would become the thing that saved her when everything else fell apart. 3 days later, Isolde had woken at 3 a.m. to dampness between her legs and a low, insistent ache in her lower back that felt different from all the other aches and pains of late pregnancy. For a moment, she'd lain perfectly still, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just another false alarm, just Braxton Hicks contractions like she'd had before. But then the first real contraction had hit, a wave of pain that stole her breath and made her gasp out loud, and she'd known. This was it. This was real. And it was too early. Far too early. She was only 32 weeks and 3 days. The baby wasn't supposed to come for another 7 weeks at least. With shaking hands, she'd called 911, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what was happening. Tried to give her address, while another contraction seized her body and made coherent speech nearly impossible. Then she'd texted Rue, but her fingers weren't working properly. Autocorrect turning her desperate plea for help into nonsense that wouldn't make any sense if Rue even saw it at 3 a.m. She'd managed to grab her hospital bag, the one she'd packed weeks ago just in case, and her wallet. But that was all she could manage before the paramedics were buzzing at her apartment door and her roommates were stumbling out of their rooms in confusion. The ambulance ride was a blur of pain and fear, sirens wailing through empty streets while a paramedic held her hand and told her to breathe, to focus, to count through the contractions that were coming faster and harder than she'd ever imagined possible. All she could think was that she was alone, completely alone. About to bring a baby into the world 7 weeks early without anyone who cared about her or the baby, without the baby's father who didn't even know the baby existed, without anyone to hold her hand or tell her it would be okay, or share in the terror and the joy of new life, arriving too soon and too fast. At the hospital, Dr. Yashira had appeared like an angel, her expression grave but determined. "We're going to do everything we can," she'd promised as they wheeled Isolde toward the delivery room. And Isolde had wanted to believe her, had clung to those words like a lifeline. "But I need you to focus, Isolde. Can you do that for me?" Isolde had nodded, but inside she was fracturing, breaking apart into pieces that would never fit back together quite right. Nobody should have to do this alone, she'd thought desperately. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Babies were supposed to come into the world surrounded by love and support and people who wanted them, not into this cold, sterile room with only paid professionals who would forget her name the moment their shift ended. "Emergency contact," a nurse had asked, tablet in hand, voice brisk and efficient in that way healthcare workers have when they're managing a crisis. Isolde had opened her mouth to say she had none, to admit the truth that she was completely alone in this, that she'd systematically cut herself off from everyone who might have helped her because she'd been too proud, too afraid, too convinced that she was protecting everyone by suffering in silence. "I'm her emergency contact." The voice had come from the doorway, and Isolde's head had snapped around so fast her neck had cracked. Because that voice, she knew that voice, would know it anywhere, in any circumstance. But it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. How could he possibly be here? Standing in the doorway in what looked like gym clothes, his hair disheveled, his face set in lines of determination, and something fierce that might have been terror, or might have been love, or might have been both, was Dashiell Kavanaugh. Behind him, looking worried but trying to smile, was his sister, the artist whose gallery opening had been Isolde's undoing 3 days ago. "How did you?" Isolde had begun, but another contraction seized her, cutting off her words, turning everything into white-hot pain that consumed her entire world. Dashiell was at her side in an instant, taking her hand, letting her grip it with desperate strength that probably hurt him, but he didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just held on like he was anchoring her to earth. "Your friend Rue called me," Dashiell had said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "She got my number from my sister, and before you tell me to leave, I'm not going anywhere. Do you understand me, Isolde? I'm not going anywhere." If your heart just dropped in that moment, don't scroll away. Subscribe, because this story isn't just fiction. It's a mirror of what we all fear, being alone until it's too late. Building walls so high to protect ourselves that we end up trapped inside them. And if you're one of the few who can watch without subscribing, tell me in the comments why, because maybe your reason will help someone else understand love differently. Maybe your truth is exactly what another person needs to hear to make a different choice than Isolde made. Mr. Kavanaugh. Dr. Yashira had said diplomatically, her eyes moving between Dashiell and Isolde with the kind of assessment that comes from years of seeing complicated family situations play out in delivery rooms. If you're going to stay, we need accurate medical history. Are you the father? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications, loaded with consequences, and Isolde looked at Dashiell with her heart in her throat, ready to repeat her lie, to send him away, to protect them both from the truth one more time, even though it was killing her. But Dashiell was looking at her with such tenderness, such unwavering presence, such complete and utter focus, that something inside her finally broke, shattered into 1,000 pieces that could never be reassembled into the lie she'd been living. She whispered, the truth spilling out like water from a cracked dam, like blood from a wound that had been festering for 8 months. He's the father. Dashiell's intake of breath was sharp, audible even over the beeping monitors and the sounds of the hospital. But you said. His voice cracked, and she watched understanding flood his features, watched him realize the full scope of what she'd done. The test. I lied, Isolde sobbed, the words pouring out now in a desperate rush, 8 months of held truth exploding out of her all at once. I lied, because you had Singapore and your deal and your whole future, and I didn't want to be the thing that ruined it. I didn't want to be my mother. I didn't want our baby to be an obligation to you. Didn't want to watch you resent us for derailing your dreams. The confession tore out of her between contractions, each word feeling like it cost her something vital, like she was bleeding out truth instead of blood. An obligation? Dashiell's voice cracked completely, and there were tears in his eyes now, actual tears sliding down his face. Isolde, do you have any idea? He'd stopped, seemed to collect himself, to push back whatever he was feeling in favor of the immediate crisis. We'll talk about this later. Right now, you need to focus on bringing our baby safely into this world. He'd squeezed her hand, brought it to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise and a prayer. Our baby. The words wrapped around Isolde's heart, terrifying and beautiful in equal measure, and as another contraction seized her, she gripped the hand of the man she loved enough to lie to, the man who'd somehow found his way to her side in her darkest moment. And for the first time in 8 months, she wasn't alone. The delivery was complicated, just as Dr. Yashira had feared. 6 hours of exhausting labor that pushed Isolde to the absolute limits of what her body could endure. But Dashiell never left her side, not once, not even when the nurses offered him breaks or suggested he might want to step out for fresh air. He stayed, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, being the partner she'd convinced herself he could never be, proving with every minute of his unwavering presence that she'd been wrong about everything. The baby arrived at 9:37 in the morning, tiny and alarmingly purple, crying with lungs that seemed too strong for such a fragile body. It's a girl, someone announced, and Isolde caught just a glimpse of her daughter before the medical team descended, all urgent efficiency and practiced movements. 4 pounds 3 ounces, a nurse called out. Small but mighty. We'll need to take her to the NICU for observation. Wait. Isolde had gasped, desperate to hold her daughter, to apologize for all the stress her body had caused during pregnancy, for the lies she'd told, for bringing her into the world 7 weeks too early. But they were already whisking the baby away, leaving Isolde feeling hollowed out and bereft, like something essential had been removed from her body, and she might never feel whole again. Dashiell squeezed her hand. I'll go with her, he'd said firmly, looking at Dr. Yashira for confirmation. I won't let her be alone. There was something profound in those words, a parallel to Isolde's own solitary pregnancy that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. He wouldn't let their daughter be alone the way Isolde had been alone, wouldn't let her enter the world without someone who loved her standing watch. As they wheeled Isolde to recovery, she felt consciousness slipping away, the exhaustion and medication pulling her under like a tide she couldn't fight. But she heard Dashiell's voice, soft and fierce, and full of a conviction that penetrated even through the fog. I've got her. I've got both of you. When Isolde woke 16 hours later, the first thing she saw was Dashiell asleep in the chair beside her hospital bed. His hand still holding hers, like he'd promised her he wouldn't let go. His hair was even more disheveled now, his clothes rumpled, dark circles under his eyes speaking of a night spent awake and vigilant. On his other arm, just visible where his sleeve had ridden up, she could see what looked like the edge of a hospital bracelet, the kind they gave to parents who were allowed in the NICU. He'd been with their daughter all night. Every minute that Isolde had been unconscious, he'd been with their baby girl, keeping the promise he'd made. Something in Isolde's chest cracked open, some final wall she'd been holding up through sheer force of will, and the tears that came weren't from pain or fear but from relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming realization that she'd been wrong, so completely and utterly wrong about everything. If this scene hits you right in the heart, don't just feel it, do something with it. Hit subscribe right now, because we tell stories that remind us why showing up matters more than saying I love you, why presence is the greatest gift we can give, why the fears that drive us to push people away are often protecting us from exactly what we need most. Don't just watch love. Learn from it. Dashiell stirred then, his eyes opening slowly, and when he saw she was awake, relief flooded his features. Hey, he said softly, sitting up straighter but not letting go of her hand. How are you feeling? His voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying or talking or both, and there was a vulnerability in his face she'd never seen before, not even during their most intimate moments 9 months ago. Exhausted? Isolde admitted, her own voice raspy from hours of screaming through contractions. Scared. How is she? The baby, how is? She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the terror that something might be wrong, that her daughter might be fighting for her life in the NICU while Isolde lay uselessly in this recovery room. She's stable, Dashiell said immediately, and the relief that flooded through Isolde was so intense it was almost painful. Doing really well, actually. They've got her on some breathing support and she's in an incubator to help regulate her temperature, but the doctors are optimistic. She's a fighter. His voice softened with wonder. She has your nose. And she gripped my finger when I touched her hand, held on like she knew who I was. Tears were streaming down Isolde's face now, and she didn't try to stop them. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Dashiell, I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have called you the second I saw those 2 pink lines and told you the truth. Trusted you to make your own choice, instead of making it for you. The words were tumbling out now, a confession that had been building for 8 months. I was so scared. Scared you'd resent us, scared you'd come back out of obligation, scared I'd become my mother and lose myself in your orbit. But I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. Dashiell brought her hand to his lips again, pressed another kiss to her knuckles. Do you know what that relief meant? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. When you said the test was negative? Isolde shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. It wasn't relief that I wasn't going to be a father, Isolde. It was relief that you weren't pregnant and alone while I was halfway around the world. I was terrified that you'd be going through that by yourself, that you'd need me, and I wouldn't be there. He paused, seemed to gather himself. If I'd known, I would have been on the next plane. I would have walked away from Singapore, from the deal, from all of it. But your company, Isolde protested weakly. Everything you'd worked for meant nothing compared to what I felt for you, Dashiell said fiercely. Do you understand that? Nothing. The Singapore deal, the billions, the empire. It was all supposed to be the foundation for a life I wanted to build, but what's the point of building anything if you're alone? I thought you'd pulled away because you didn't want me anymore, because our relationship had been a fun fling for you, but nothing serious. That's why I stopped messaging. I thought I was respecting your choice to move on. Isolde was fully crying now, great gasping sobs that hurt her exhausted abdominal muscles, but she couldn't stop. I never wanted to move on, she managed. I loved you. I've loved you this entire time, but I watched my mother sacrifice everything for my father's career, watched her become invisible, and I swore I'd never do the same. I thought I was protecting both of us. You thought I was your father, Dashiell said quietly, with a perception that shouldn't have surprised her but did. But I'm not your father, and you're not your mother, and this is our story, not theirs. We get to write it differently. He squeezed her hand. And yeah, maybe I would have struggled. Maybe I would have panicked and made mistakes, but you didn't give me the chance to choose, Isolde. You made the choice for both of us and then carried it alone for 8 months. He was right. Of course he was right. She'd been so focused on protecting him from a burden she'd assumed he didn't want that she'd never considered what he might actually want, never trusted him enough to include him in the decision, never believed that he might surprise her. I'm sorry, she whispered again, because it was all she could say, because no other word seemed adequate for the magnitude of what she'd done. I forgive you, Dashiell said simply, and the words were like a key turning in a lock, releasing pressure Isolde hadn't realized she'd been holding. But you need to forgive yourself too, Isolde. You need to stop carrying the weight of your mother's choices and your father's failures. You need to let me be who I actually am, not who you're afraid I might become. A nurse knocked softly on the door then, interrupting the moment. Miss Brennan, the baby's stable enough for a quick visit if you're feeling up to it. We'll bring a wheelchair. Isolde looked at Dashiell, and he nodded encouragingly. Let's go meet our daughter, he said, and there was so much hope and joy in his voice that Isolde felt something inside her begin to heal, begin to believe that maybe they could actually do this. Maybe the lie could be forgiven. Maybe they could build something real from the wreckage of her deception. The NICU was a place of hushed voices and beeping monitors, of tiny babies in plastic isolettes, fighting battles no one so small should have to fight. A nurse led them to the far corner, where their daughter lay beneath warming lights, wires and tubes attached to her impossibly small body. She was wearing a diaper that looked comically large on her, and a tiny knitted cap in pale purple. Her eyes were closed, her miniature fists clenched, her chest rising and falling with the assistance of the breathing apparatus. She's perfect, Isolde breathed, pressing her hand against the isolette's plastic wall, wishing she could reach through and touch her daughter's skin. Feel the reality of her. She's so perfect. She needs a name, Dashiell said softly, standing beside her, his own hand pressed against the plastic near hers. We never talked about names. They stood there in the soft light of the NICU, watching their daughter breathe, and began the first conversation of what Isolde realized would be thousands, began making decisions together instead of alone, began building the foundation of a family that had started with lies, but was being reconstructed with truth. And as Dashiell suggested names and Isolde countered with others, as they laughed quietly at some suggestions and grew serious at others, as their hands moved closer together on the isolette until their fingers were intertwined, she felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time in 8 months, fragile but real, the kind of hope that comes from finally putting down a burden you were never meant to carry alone. But healing would take more than one perfect moment in a NICU, more than forgiveness spoken in a recovery room, more than the fierce joy of meeting their daughter together. Because while Dashiell had forgiven her lie instantly, while he'd shown up without hesitation when she needed him most, Isolde would spend months learning to forgive herself, learning to trust that his presence wasn't obligation but choice, learning to build a relationship based on truth instead of the comfortable lies she'd told herself about protection and sacrifice. The baby stayed in the NICU for 3 weeks, and those weeks became a crash course in parenthood and partnership for both of them. Dashiell canceled all his meetings, delegated responsibilities to his business partner, and essentially moved into the hospital, learning to change diapers the size of his palm, and monitor feeding tubes, and read the bewildering array of numbers on the machines that kept their daughter stable. Isolde pumped breast milk every 2 hours, her body producing nourishment for a baby she could only hold for carefully supervised minutes, her hormones wreaking havoc on her emotions until she cried at the slightest provocation. They did the careful dance of 2 people learning each other again, trying to figure out what they were to each other now. Were they a couple? Co-parents? Something undefined and tentative? Dashiell found an apartment near the hospital and insisted Isolde stay with him when she was discharged, and she'd been too exhausted to argue, too grateful for the help to let pride stand in the way. It was practical, she told herself. It wasn't romantic. He had a guest room with its own bathroom, and she could pretend she was staying with a friend rather than the father of her child. The man she'd loved and lied to, and was terrified of loving again because what if she'd destroyed any chance they might have had? Their first real fight happened in week 2. Standing in the NICU at 2 a.m. while their daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the tension crackling between her parents. Dashiell had handled some paperwork, had put his name on forms and paid bills that insurance didn't cover. Kavanaugh had been with the financial arrangements. "I don't need you to rescue me," Isolde had said, her voice sharp with exhaustion and hormones and pride that she hadn't quite managed to set down. "I can handle my own expenses." They'd moved to the family consultation room, keeping their voices low so as not to disturb the other NICU families, but the intensity hadn't diminished. "I'm not rescuing you," Dashiell had replied, frustration creeping into his usually controlled voice. "I'm being a father. I'm being here, being present, taking responsibility for my daughter's medical care. What did you expect, Isolde? That I'd show up and then stand back and let you struggle financially on top of everything else you're dealing with? I expected you to ask," she'd shot back. "I expected you to include me in decisions, instead of just taking over." As soon as the words left her mouth, she'd realized the irony, had seen Dashiell's expression shift as he recognized it too. "You mean the way you included me in the decision to keep your pregnancy secret for 8 months? He'd asked quietly, and the words had landed like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, that wasn't fair. We're both learning here, Isolde. I'm trying to figure out how to be a father to a daughter I didn't know existed until 3 weeks ago, how to support you without overstepping, how to help without making you feel controlled. But you have to meet me halfway. You have to let me be involved, let me contribute, let me actually be a partner in this instead of an obstacle you're constantly trying to navigate around." He'd been right, and that had been the hardest part. Isolde had been so focused on maintaining her independence, on proving she didn't need him even though she did, on protecting herself from the vulnerability of accepting help that she'd been pushing away the exact thing she claimed to want. They'd talked until dawn that morning, really talked for the first time since that video call 9 months ago where she'd lied about the pregnancy test. They'd established boundaries and expectations, had agreed to make decisions together, had promised to communicate, even when it was uncomfortable or scary, or felt like admitting weakness. It wasn't perfect. They fought again, would fight many more times in the coming months about schedules and boundaries, and the 1,000 tiny decisions that come with raising a child. But something had shifted that night in the consultation room. Some foundation had been laid that would hold even when everything else felt shaky. The baby's first real crisis came during week 3, a sudden breathing irregularity that sent alarms shrieking and nurses running, that made Isolde's world narrow down to the terrifying sight of her daughter struggling, monitors screaming their warnings. Dashiell had grabbed her hand, and they'd stood together in frozen terror while the medical team worked, while minutes stretched into hours, while every worst-case scenario played out in their minds. When the crisis passed, when their daughter stabilized and the alarms fell silent, Isolde had collapsed against Dashiell's chest and cried 8 months of held emotion, all the fear and loneliness and regret and desperate love pouring out of her in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "Let it out," he'd whispered, his arms around her, his own tears falling into her hair. "All of it. I've got you." And she'd believed him, had finally let herself believe that he meant it, that his presence wasn't temporary or obligatory, but chosen, deliberate, as permanent as he could make it. The day they brought their daughter home was bright and unseasonably warm for late November, the kind of day that felt like a gift after weeks of cold rain and gray skies. They left the hospital with a car seat that looked impossibly large for the 4-pound baby strapped carefully inside it with a folder full of discharge instructions and follow-up appointments, with medications and special formula, and the overwhelming knowledge that they were now entirely responsible for keeping this tiny human alive. Dashiell drove with exaggerated caution, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure the baby was still breathing, still okay, still real. Isolde sat in the back beside the car seat, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's chest, feeling the reassuring rise and fall, hardly daring to breathe herself. They'd named her Lyra, after the constellation, because she'd been born under a clear night sky, and because Dashiell had said she was already his fixed point, his navigation, the star he'd orient his entire life around. The apartment had been transformed, while Isolde recovered in the hospital. The guest room she'd been staying in was still hers, but the master bedroom now held a complete nursery setup, crib with soft white sheets, changing table stocked with everything they could possibly need, a mobile of silver stars hanging above the crib that slowly rotated and played a gentle lullaby. A rocking chair sat in the corner, positioned to catch the morning light from the window. "I did this while you were sleeping at the hospital," Dashiell confessed, watching Isolde's face as she took in the room, as tears spilled down her cheeks for the 100th time that week. I wanted Lyra to come home to something beautiful, something that said she was wanted and waited for, even if we didn't know about her as early as we should have. The first night home was terrifying and exhausting, and occasionally hilarious in that delirious way that only sleep deprivation can create. Lyra cried every 90 minutes, demanding to be fed, changed, held, soothed back to sleep, only to wake again before they could fully settle themselves. They took shifts at first, trying to let each other rest, but by 3 a.m. they'd given up and were both awake, stumbling around the nursery in a fog of exhaustion, sharing the duties because doing it together somehow made it less overwhelming. There was one moment, around 4 a.m, when Lyra had finally fallen asleep after an hour of crying, when both Isolde and Dashiell stood over her crib just watching her breathe, making sure she was really okay, really stable, really going to survive this transition from hospital to home. I know we haven't talked about us, Dashiell had said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. About what we are to each other, what this is. Isolde had tensed, waiting for the gentle letdown, for the acknowledgement that they were co-parents, and that was all they'd ever be after what she'd done. But before he could finish, Lyra had spit up, projectile vomit that somehow managed to hit both of them despite the fact that she was still in her crib. They'd both frozen for a second, looking down at their stained clothing, and then they'd started laughing, quietly at first and then harder, trying to muffle the sound so they didn't wake Lyra again, laughing until they were both bent double and gasping for air, until the serious conversation they'd been about to have dissolved into the absurd reality of new parenthood where nothing ever went according to plan. The days blurred together after that, a routine of feeding and changing and sleeping in desperate snatches whenever Lyra would allow it. But slowly, gradually, they found their rhythm. Dashiell would get up for the first night feeding, Isolde for the second. They'd share breakfast in exhausted silence, passing Lyra back and forth between them while they ate whatever they could manage with one hand. Dashiell worked from home, taking conference calls with a sleeping baby against his chest, learning to type one-handed while supporting Lyra's head with the other. Isolde caught him one night at 2 a.m, standing by Lyra's crib singing softly in a voice she'd never heard him use before, some lullaby he must have remembered from his own childhood. He was swaying slightly, his hand on Lyra's stomach, and the tenderness in his face made Isolde's heart ache with something that felt dangerously close to falling in love all over again. Or maybe, she realized, she'd never stopped being in love with him at all, had just been too scared to admit it, too convinced that she destroyed any chance they might have had. You've come this far. Don't stop here. Subscribe, because if this story made you feel anything, regret, or hope, or the recognition of your own fears reflected back at you, you're exactly where you belong. And if you think you could have survived Isolde's choices, if you think you would have done differently or the same, tell me in the comments, because I read every one, and maybe your truth is what someone else needs to hear today. 6 weeks after Lyra came home, after she'd put on weight and graduated from her preemie clothes to newborn size, after the pediatrician had declared her healthy and thriving and a minor miracle given her early arrival, Dashiell's sister came to visit. She'd been kept away during the most critical weeks, but now she arrived at the apartment bearing gifts and an elaborate meal she'd cooked herself, declaring that new parents needed proper nutrition and not just whatever they could grab from the refrigerator. She was warm to Isolde but wary in that way, protective siblings get, loving her niece instantly, but clearly reserving judgment about the woman who'd kept that niece a secret from her brother for 8 months. They had a moment alone in the kitchen while Dashiell was putting Lyra down for a nap, and his sister had turned to Isolde with an expression that was both kind and steel. He was devastated when you pulled away, she said quietly, not accusing but stating facts. After Singapore, after you stopped responding to his messages, I watched him work himself to death because he thought you didn't want him anymore. He convinced himself that what you'd had was just a fling for you, something fun but not serious, and that he'd been an idiot for falling so hard so fast. Guilt twisted in Isolde's gut, adding to the mountain of it she'd been carrying. I never wanted that, she whispered. I was trying to protect him, to give him the freedom to build his empire without being tied down. Tied down, his sister repeated, and something in her voice made Isolde look up. Is that really what you think a family is? A burden? An obligation? She softened slightly, seeing the tears in Isolde's eyes. Look, I'm not saying you should have followed him to Singapore, given up your own life and dreams. That would have been wrong too. Would have built resentment into the foundation of your relationship. But you could have trusted him enough to tell him the truth and let him make his own choices. That's what partners do. They choose each other every day, even when it's hard. She'd paused, studying Isolde carefully. But I've never seen him like this, she finally admitted. Happy, present, himself. He used to disappear into his work, used to measure his worth in quarterly earnings and market share. Now he measures his day in Lyra's smiles and your laughter and family dinners at reasonable hours. So don't hurt him again, Isolde. Don't lie to him again. Because next time he might not be able to forgive you. I won't, Isolde had promised, meaning it with every fiber of her being. I couldn't. I won't. That evening, after his sister left and Lyra was asleep for what they hoped would be at least a 3-hour stretch, Dashiell had asked Isolde to sit down, had said they needed to talk in that tone that made her heart race with anxiety. This was it, she'd thought. This was where he gently explained that co-parenting was working, but they needed boundaries, needed to figure out living arrangements that gave them both space, needed to acknowledge that what they'd had before was gone and couldn't be rebuilt from the ruins of her lie. But instead, Dashiell had taken her hands in his, had looked at her with an intensity that reminded her of that first night at the Warehouse Theater, and had said, I fell in love with you in that warehouse 9 months ago, and I never stopped. Not during Singapore, not when you pulled away, not during these last 8 months when I thought I'd lost you forever. And now, seeing you with our daughter, watching you become this incredible mother, learning who you are under pressure and exhaustion and fear, I'm completely gone, Isolde. I'm all in. He'd paused, seeming to gather courage, vulnerability written across every line of his face. But I need to know where you are. I understand if you're not there yet, if the lie was because you didn't feel the same way, if you need time or space, or if you want to keep things strictly co-parenting. I'll respect whatever you need, but I can't keep pretending I don't want more. I can't keep sleeping in the guest room and pretending I don't want to be in yours. I can't keep acting like we're just two people raising a child together when what I want is to build a life with you, a real life, a future. Isolde's heart had been thundering in her chest, tears streaming down her face, and all the words she'd been holding back for weeks, for months. For 9 months since that Warehouse Theater came pouring out. I lied because I loved you too much, she'd whispered, her voice breaking. I was terrified of becoming my mother, terrified of watching you resent me and our baby for derailing your dreams. Terrified that you'd come back out of obligation and spend the rest of your life wishing you'd chosen differently. But I was wrong, Dashiell. About everything. I loved you then. I never stopped loving you. And now, watching you with Lyra, watching you show up every single day, even when you're exhausted, even when it's hard, even when I've given you every reason to walk away, I'm falling in love with you all over again. So, what do we do about it? He'd asked, moving closer, his hands coming up to cup her face, thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. We start over, Isolde had said, leaning into his touch like she was starving for it, which she was. We build something real this time, based on truth instead of fear. We make mistakes and forgive each other for them. We choose each other, every day, even when it's terrifying. She'd paused, managed a watery smile. And maybe you stop sleeping in the guest room, because I'm tired of pretending I don't want you in mine. They should have kissed then. That's what would have happened in movies or romance novels, some sweeping cinematic moment with swelling music and perfect lighting. But this was real life, messy and complicated, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. Because Lyra had started crying right then, her wails carrying through the baby monitor on the coffee table, demanding a diaper change and a feeding, and her parents' immediate attention. They looked at each other and started laughing, foreheads pressed together, and somehow that felt more romantic than any kiss could have been, more real than any Hollywood ending. Rain check on the kiss? Dashiell had asked, and Isolde had nodded, both of them getting up to tend to their daughter, to the life they were building one imperfect moment at a time. The kiss happened 2 days later, at 4 in the morning while Lyra slept peacefully in her crib after a particularly rough night. They'd both been exhausted, functioning on maybe 3 hours of sleep total, standing in the kitchen making coffee because there was no point in going back to bed. Dashiell had been trying to pour milk into his coffee and missing the cup entirely, and Isolde had started laughing at the growing puddle on the counter, and he'd turned to her with sleep-deprived indignation that melted into something softer, something tender, and then he'd been kissing her, gentle at first and then deeper, tasting like coffee, and promises, and the future they were choosing together. "Good morning," he'd murmured against her lips when they finally pulled apart, and she'd smiled, really smiled, for what felt like the first time in 9 months. "It is now," she'd replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The months that followed were a delicate dance of building a relationship while caring for an infant who demanded everything they had and more. There were beautiful moments and terrible ones. Days when everything felt perfect, and days when they fought about whose turn it was to do laundry, or whether Lyra's cry meant hunger or gas, or just general infant rage at the world. But they were doing it together, communicating, instead of retreating into silence, choosing honesty even when it was uncomfortable, learning who they were as partners and not just co-parents. Dashiell moved his things out of the guest room on a Saturday morning 2 months after their kitchen kiss, officially making the master bedroom theirs, making the apartment feel like a home instead of a temporary arrangement. He'd restructured his entire company, delegating responsibilities he'd previously hoarded, hiring a second-in-command who could handle day-to-day operations, while Dashiell focused on being present for his family. His business partner had called him crazy, had warned him that stepping back even partially could cost him his competitive edge, but Dashiell had just shrugged and said that he'd already lost 8 months of Lyra's life, and he wasn't willing to miss another day chasing profits that didn't mean anything if he had no one to share them with. Isolde had been terrified he'd resent that choice, eventually, that he'd wake up one day and realize what he'd sacrificed and blame her for it. But he'd caught her spiraling one night and had taken her face in his hands. "I'm not your father," he'd said firmly, "and you're not your mother. I'm choosing this, Isolde. I'm choosing you and Lyra and family dinners and midnight feedings and a life that has meaning beyond quarterly earnings reports. Stop waiting for me to regret it and just let me love you." She'd been working on it, seeing a therapist who specialized in postpartum anxiety and childhood trauma, learning to separate her parents' story from her own, learning to trust that Dashiell's presence was chosen and not forced. It was hard work, uncomfortable work, the kind that made her want to retreat behind her old walls and protective lies. But she kept showing up, kept being honest, kept choosing vulnerability, even when everything in her screamed to protect herself. 4 months after Lyra came home, Isolde had started sketching again, tentative at first, just doodles in the margins of grocery lists and appointment reminders. But gradually those doodles had evolved into actual costume designs, ideas for theater productions she wasn't working on, concepts that excited her creatively for the first time in almost a year. Dashiell had noticed, had encouraged her to reach out to the theater community she'd ghosted during her pregnancy to rebuild those bridges she'd burned. "What if they're angry I disappeared?" she'd asked, fear making her voice small. "What if they don't want to work with someone who flaked on them for 8 months? Then they're not worth working with," Dashiell had replied simply. "But I bet most of them will understand. Life happens, Isolde. Complications happen. People who care about you will give you grace." And he'd been right. Of course, because when Isolde had finally worked up the courage to call the artistic director of the warehouse theater where she and Dashiell had met, the woman had been overjoyed to hear from her, had congratulated her on the baby, and immediately asked if she'd be interested in designing costumes for their spring production. Dashiell had insisted on investing in proper equipment for a home studio, had helped her convert one of the spare rooms into a workspace with industrial sewing machines and fabric storage, and a design table with perfect natural lighting. "This is yours," he'd said when she'd protested the expense. "Your dream, your business, built on your terms. I'm just providing the safety net." That distinction had mattered, had been the difference between feeling supported and feeling controlled, and Isolde had thrown herself into the work with passion she'd forgotten she possessed. 6 months after Lyra's birth, Isolde's mother had come to visit, meeting her granddaughter for the first time and seeing Dashiell in person after only hearing about him through stilted phone conversations. The visit had been tense at first, layers of complicated history between mother and daughter, creating awkward silences and careful conversations. But on the second evening, after Lyra was asleep and Dashiell had tactfully excused himself to give them privacy, Isolde's mother had taken her daughter's hands and said the words Isolde hadn't known she needed to hear. "You didn't repeat my mistakes," her mother had said, her voice thick with emotion. "You broke the pattern. I spent 30 years following your father from city to city, giving up my own dreams because I thought that's what love meant, and I watched resentment eat away at us from the inside until there was nothing left. But you refused to follow Dashiell when it would have cost you yourself, and then you built a partnership instead of a hierarchy. I'm so proud of you." "But I lied to him for 8 months," Isolde had protested, the guilt still a constant companion. "I kept his daughter from him, made decisions that weren't mine to make alone. And you've spent every day since then choosing differently." Her mother had countered gently. "That's what growth looks like, sweetheart. Not perfection, but the willingness to recognize mistakes and do better. I never had that courage. I just kept making the same choices over and over, expecting different results." She'd paused, squeezed Isolde's hands. "Dashiell's a good man. He's not your father. And you're stronger than I ever was." That conversation had been a turning point, a release of guilt Isolde had been carrying not just about her own lies, but about her mother's choices, about generational patterns she'd been terrified of continuing. She'd finally begun to forgive herself, to accept that she'd made the best decision she could with the information and fear she'd had at the time, and that the real measure of character wasn't in never making mistakes, but in how you handle the aftermath. Lyra thrived as the months passed, putting on weight and hitting developmental milestones, transforming from a fragile preemie into a robust baby with her mother's smile and her father's intense gaze. She was 8 months old now, babbling constantly in her own language, fascinated by everything, reaching for the world with chubby hands and fearless curiosity. Isolde and Dashiell had developed the kind of rhythm that only comes from months of trial and error, could communicate entire conversations with just a look, knew each other's breaking points, and how to provide support before anyone had to ask for it. They'd talk late at night sometimes, after Lyra was asleep, about the future they wanted to build, about maybe getting married someday when it felt right, about whether they wanted more children, or if Lyra would be their only one, about moving to a bigger place with a yard where Lyra could play as she grew. They'd talk about Isolde's growing costume design business and Dashiell's plans to start a non-profit focused on technology education for underprivileged youth, about dreams and goals, and the life they were creating together. But there was one conversation they kept not having, one topic that neither of them seemed willing to broach directly. What would they tell Lyra someday about her origin story? About the lie that had kept her father from knowing she existed for 8 months? About the complicated circumstances of her arrival? It hung between them, unspoken but present, a shadow that would eventually need to be addressed, but that both of them were content to leave for another day, another year, another time. When Lyra was old enough to ask questions, they weren't quite ready to answer. It was a Wednesday evening in early June, unseasonably warm with humidity that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe, when everything changed again. Dashiell had been at a board meeting, one of the few in-person commitments he still maintained, and Isolde had been home with Lyra, working on sketches for the fall theater season, while the baby played with fabric scraps on the floor beside her. Her phone had rung, an unknown number that she almost didn't answer, but something had made her pick up, some instinct that told her this call mattered. "Is this Isolde Brennan?" a professional female voice had asked, and when Isolde confirmed, the voice had continued. "This is Rebecca Winters from Tech Innovate magazine. I'm working on a profile piece about Dashiell Kavanaugh and his remarkable career trajectory, and I understand you're the mother of his child. I'd love to schedule an interview to get your perspective on how he's balanced fatherhood with building his empire." Isolde's blood had run cold. A magazine profile, public scrutiny, questions about their relationship, about Lyra, about the timeline that would reveal she'd kept the pregnancy secret. "I don't think that's something we're interested in," she'd said carefully, keeping her voice neutral, even though panic was rising in her throat. "We prefer to keep our private life private." "I completely understand," Rebecca had replied smoothly, in a tone that suggested she understood nothing at all. "But I should mention that the article is happening with or without your participation. Mr. Kavanaugh has already agreed to be interviewed, and we have plenty of other sources. I'm offering you the chance to ensure your side of the story is represented accurately. Think it over and give me a call back if you change your mind." After the call ended, Isolde had sat in stunned silence, Lyra's babbling fading into background noise as her mind raced through implications and consequences. A public profile meant public questions, meant journalists digging into timelines and circumstances, meant the possibility of their story becoming fodder for gossip and speculation. It meant Lyra would grow up with Google results about her parents' complicated beginning, meant strangers would have opinions about choices that weren't any of their business. When Dashiell had come home 2 hours later, Isolde had been pacing the living room, Lyra already asleep in her crib, anxiety wounds so tight in her chest she could barely breathe. "We need to talk," she'd said, and proceeded to explain about the call, about the magazine profile, about her fears of their private pain becoming public entertainment. Dashiell's expression had gone carefully blank, that mask he wore during high-stakes negotiations sliding into place. "I agreed to the interview before I knew they'd be contacting you," he'd said slowly. "The profile is part of a series on young CEOs who've successfully balanced career and family, and my publicist thought it would be good for the company's image, humanize the brand." He'd paused, studying her face. "But if you're uncomfortable, I'll cancel it. We can tell them to kill the entire piece." "And what happens next time?" Isolde had challenged, her voice rising with frustration and fear. "And the time after that? We can't hide forever, Dashiell. You're a public figure now, whether we like it or not. Eventually, someone's going to dig into our history, going to discover that the timeline doesn't quite add up, going to write think pieces about the woman who kept a billionaire's baby secret." She'd stopped pacing, turned to face him fully. What do we tell Lyra when she's old enough to read those articles? When her classmates find them online and ask her why her mother lied to her father? The question hung between them. The conversation they'd been avoiding for 8 months, suddenly unavoidable. Forced into the open by external pressure neither of them had anticipated. Dashiell had moved closer, reaching for her hands, but Isolde had pulled away, the old instinct to protect herself surging up strong and overwhelming. Maybe this was a mistake, she'd whispered, the words coming from some dark place of fear she'd thought she'd moved past. "Maybe we're just playing house, pretending we can make this work when the foundation is built on lies and fear and choices I can never take back." "Don't do that," Dashiell had said, his voice sharp now, cutting through her spiral. "Don't use this as an excuse to push me away, to retreat behind your walls and convince yourself you're protecting everyone by suffering alone. We're past that, Isolde. We've built something real here, something that matters more than bad publicity or gossipy articles or what strangers might think about our story." "But what about Lyra?" Isolde had demanded, tears streaming down her face now. "What about when she asks why you weren't there for her birth, why you didn't know she existed, why her mother thought lying was better than trusting her father with the truth? What do we tell her then?" "We tell her the truth," Dashiell had replied simply, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "We tell her that you were scared and made a choice you thought was right, that I wasn't there because I didn't know I was needed, that we've spent every day since then choosing each other and building a family based on honesty instead of fear. We tell her that love is complicated and messy, and sometimes people make mistakes, but what matters is how they handle those mistakes afterward." Isolde had wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that simple narrative and move forward, but the old fears were clawing at her, whispering that she'd destroyed everything, that the consequences of her lie were finally catching up with her, that she should have known from the beginning that you can't build happiness on a foundation of deception no matter how well-intentioned. "I need some air," she'd said, grabbing her keys, heading for the door before Dashiell could respond. "I just need to think, to clear my head. I'll be back soon." She'd been out the door before he could stop her, before she could see the hurt flash across his face, before she could recognize that she was doing exactly what he'd accused her of, using fear as an excuse to run instead of staying and fighting through the discomfort. The streets were nearly empty at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, humid air pressing down like a weight, and Isolde walked without direction, just moving because standing still felt impossible. Her phone buzzed repeatedly in her pocket, texts from Dashiell that she didn't read, didn't want to face yet. She ended up at a small park 3 blocks from the apartment, sitting on a swing that creaked under her weight, staring up at a sky too bright with light pollution to show any stars. How long she sat there she didn't know. Could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, time losing meaning while she spiraled through every worst-case scenario her anxiety could conjure. But eventually her phone rang, not with Dashiell's ringtone but with Rue's, and Isolde answered without thinking. "Where are you?" Rue asked without preamble, her voice tight with concern. "Dashiell called me, said you ran out upset and you're not answering his texts. He's worried sick, Isolde." "I'm at Riverside Park," Isolde admitted, her voice hollow. "I just needed space to think." "About what? About whether you're going to sabotage the best thing that's ever happened to you because you're scared?" Rue's bluntness should have made Isolde angry, but instead it just made her tired. "I've been watching you these past 8 months, watching you finally let yourself be happy, watching you build something real with Dashiell, watching Lyra thrive with 2 parents who love her desperately. And now, one phone call from a reporter and you're ready to throw it all away?" "You don't understand," Isolde whispered. "The whole world is going to know I lied. They're going to judge me, judge us, judge every choice I made." "So what?" Rue challenged. "Who cares what strangers think? The only opinions that matter are yours, Dashiell's, and eventually, Lyra's. And if you run now, if you let fear win again, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what you could have had if you'd just been brave enough to stay." The words hit like a slap, like a bucket of cold water, like exactly what Isolde needed to hear even if she didn't want to. "I'm so tired of being scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'm so tired of waiting for everything to fall apart." "Then stop waiting and start living," Rue said gently. "Go home to your family, Isolde. Have the hard conversations. Face the uncomfortable truths. But do it together instead of alone this time." Isolde sat on that swing for another 10 minutes after the call ended, letting Rue's words sink in, letting herself feel all the fear, and then choosing to walk through it anyway. Then she stood up, brushed off her jeans, and headed back toward the apartment, toward the life she'd almost run away from, toward the man who'd proven over and over that he wasn't going anywhere even when she tried to push him away. The apartment was quiet when she let herself in, just one lamp left on in the living room casting soft shadows across the furniture. Dashiell was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, and he looked up when he heard the door, relief and hurt warring on his face. "You came back," he said, his voice rough like he'd been crying. "I'm sorry," Isolde whispered, moving toward him, sitting beside him on the couch. "I'm sorry I ran. Sorry I let fear take over. Sorry I keep doing this even when I know better." She paused, forced herself to continue. "I'm terrified, Dashiell. Terrified of the world knowing my mistakes. Terrified of Lyra someday reading about the lie I told. Terrified that I've damaged her before she's even old enough to understand what happened." "So we'll face it together," Dashiell said, taking her hands, holding on like an anchor. "We'll do the interview or we won't. Whatever feels right to both of us. We'll control the narrative as much as we can, and accept that we can't control everything. And when Lyra's old enough to ask questions, we'll answer them honestly. And we'll hope she understands that her parents are human and flawed and did the best they could with what they knew at the time." They talked until 3 in the morning, hashing out what they wanted to do about the magazine profile, deciding together that they'd participate, but set strict boundaries about what was and wasn't open for discussion, that they'd tell their story on their terms, rather than letting someone else define their narrative. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. Was them choosing to face the uncomfortable together instead of retreating into their separate corners and dealing with fear alone. 3 weeks later, the magazine profile went live, a glossy spread with photos of Dashiell in his element at tech conferences interspersed with carefully curated family photos they'd agreed to provide. The article was surprisingly sympathetic, focusing on Dashiell's commitment to work-life balance and his dedication to being present for his daughter rather than dwelling on the complicated circumstances of Lyra's arrival. There was one paragraph about Isolde that mentioned she'd kept the pregnancy private initially, but that they'd successfully co-parented and built a strong family unit, phrased in a way that was respectful rather than salacious. The comments section was less kind, full of strangers with opinions about choices that weren't theirs to make, speculation about timelines and motivations, judgment from people who'd never walked a mile in Isolde's shoes. Dashiell had wanted to shield her from them, had told her not to read the comments, but Isolde had made herself look anyway, had let herself feel the sting of public opinion, and then chosen to set it down, to recognize that those voices didn't matter, didn't know her, didn't get a vote in how she lived her life. What surprised her was the number of messages she received privately, women reaching out through her professional social media accounts to share their own stories of fear and secrecy during pregnancy, of difficult choices made in impossible circumstances, of judgment they'd faced and survived. She hadn't expected solidarity, hadn't expected understanding, but there it was, proof that she wasn't alone, that her story resonated with others who'd walked similar paths and found their way through to the other side. Life settled back into routine after that, the media attention fading as quickly as it had appeared, some other scandal or story taking their place in the news cycle. Lyra turned 1 year old with a small celebration at the apartment, just family and close friends. Dashiell's sister bringing an elaborate 3-tier cake that Lyra proceeded to destroy with gleeful abandon, smearing frosting everywhere and laughing at the chaos she created. Isolde had watched her daughter, healthy and thriving, and completely oblivious to the complicated circumstances of her arrival, and had felt something in her chest finally relax, finally believe that maybe they were going to be okay, that maybe the lie hadn't destroyed everything after all. It was 2 weeks after Lyra's first birthday when Dashiell had sat Isolde down again, that same serious expression on his face that he'd had when he'd confessed his love 6 months earlier, and Isolde had braced herself for whatever was coming, good or bad. "I've been thinking about something," he'd said, taking her hands. "About us, about our future, about what I want our life to look like." He'd paused, seemed to gather courage. "I want to marry you, Isolde. Not someday, not eventually, but soon. I want Lyra to grow up seeing her parents choose each other every day. Want to build a life that's official and permanent and real." Isolde's heart had started racing, tears already forming in her eyes. "Are you proposing?" she'd managed to ask, and Dashiell had smiled, that smile that transformed his entire face and reminded her of the first night they met. "Not yet," he'd replied. "Not until I have a ring and a plan and the perfect moment. But I'm telling you now so you have time to think about it, time to decide if that's what you want too, time to process whatever fears or doubts you need to work through before I actually ask. Because when I propose, Isolde, I want to know your answer is yes. I want to know you're as certain about us as I am." "I'm certain," she'd whispered, the words coming easier than she'd expected, surprising her with their truth. "I've been certain for months. I just didn't know if you—" "I am," he'd interrupted gently. "I've been certain since the delivery room, since you finally told me the truth and let me be part of this. I just needed you to catch up, to believe it too." 3 days later, on a Saturday morning when summer rain was falling gentle and steady outside the windows, Dashiell had gotten down on one knee in their living room while Lyra watched from her playmat, gurgling happily at the sight of her father doing something unusual. The ring was simple, but perfect, a single stone that caught the light and threw rainbow fragments across the walls, and when he'd asked, "Will you marry me?" Isolde hadn't hesitated, hadn't let fear or doubt or the voice of her old trauma have any say in her answer. "Yes," she'd said, and meant it with every fiber of her being, meant it more than she'd ever meant anything in her life. They'd kissed while Lyra clapped her hands together in baby applause, and Isolde had felt something fundamental shift inside her. Some final piece of her heart that had been closed off and protected finally opening up to let the light in. The wedding was small and intimate, just 6 months later in the same warehouse theater where they'd first met, full circle and perfect in its symmetry. Isolde wore a dress she designed herself, ivory silk with delicate beading that caught the stage lights, and Dashiell wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn to that first art gallery encounter, claiming it was lucky. Lyra was their flower girl, toddling down the aisle ahead of them, scattering rose petals with enthusiastic imprecision, her little dress matching her mother's, her smile bright enough to light the entire room. But it was the vows that undid everyone in attendance, Dashiell and Isolde facing each other on that stage and speaking truths that were raw and real and achingly honest. "I promise to tell you the truth," Isolde had said, her voice trembling but strong. "Even when I'm scared, even when lies feel safer, even when honesty makes me vulnerable. I promise to choose you every day, to trust you enough to include you in my decisions, to believe that you're not my father and I'm not my mother and we get to write our own story. I promise to forgive myself for the choices I made when I didn't know better, and to do better now that I do." I promise to show up, Dashiell had responded, tears streaming down his face openly, unashamed, every single time, without exception, without hesitation, even when it's hard. Even when it would be easier to prioritize work or money or empire building. I promise to prove through action and not just words that you and Lyra are my fixed point, my true north, the success that actually matters. I promise to forgive your past and trust in our future, and to spend the rest of my life earning the gift you've given me by letting me be Lyra's father and your husband. There wasn't a dry eye in the theater by the time they exchanged rings and sealed their promises with a kiss that tasted like salt and joy and the sweetness of second chances earned through hard work and brutal honesty. The reception was exactly what they wanted, intimate and full of laughter, good food and better company, their closest friends and family celebrating not just a wedding, but a healing, a transformation, a love story that had started with lies, but had been reconstructed with truth. As Isolde and Dashiell swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, Lyra asleep in a portable crib nearby, Isolde pressed her face against her husband's chest and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" he murmured into her hair. "For not giving up on me," she replied. "For showing up at the hospital when I didn't ask you to. For forgiving me when I didn't deserve it. For proving every single day that love is a choice you make even when it's hard. Thank you for finally letting me love you," he countered. "For being brave enough to tell the truth when it would have been easier to lie. For building this family with me. For giving me Lyra and yourself, and a future I never knew I wanted until I almost lost it." They stayed like that for a long moment, swaying to music neither of them was really hearing, holding each other like they'd learned to hold each other over the past year and a half, with honesty and trust, and the kind of love that's forged in fire and comes out stronger for it. And as the night deepened and their guests began to drift away, as they carried their sleeping daughter up to the apartment that was now officially their home, as they stood together in the nursery watching Lyra sleep with her tiny fists curled and her face peaceful, Isolde felt something she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Peace. Complete, uncomplicated peace, with the choices she'd made, the consequences she'd faced, the life she was building. She'd thought love was an obligation, thought protecting Dashiell from the truth was the same as loving him, thought bearing her burden alone was noble rather than fearful. But she'd been wrong about everything. And the wrongness had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this life that was messy and imperfect and absolutely everything she'd never known she needed. "What are you thinking?" Dashiell whispered, his arm around her waist, his hand resting over hers on Lyra's crib rail. "I'm thinking about the story we'll tell her someday," Isolde admitted. "About how we met and fell apart and found our way back together. About the lies I told. And the truth that set us free. About how her arrival saved us both in ways we didn't even know we needed saving." She paused, turned to look at her husband in the soft glow of the nursery nightlight. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am that Rue called you that night, that you showed up when I needed you most, that you forgave me when I didn't know how to forgive myself. I'm thinking," Dashiell said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple, "that Lyra is the luckiest kid in the world to have you as her mother. Flawed and human, and brave enough to admit when you're wrong. That's the lesson I want her to learn. Not that we're perfect, but that we try, that we show up, that we do better when we know better." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching their daughter breathe, until Dashiell's phone buzzed urgently in his pocket, startling them both. He pulled it out, frowning at the screen, and Isolde watched his expression change from confusion to shock to something she couldn't quite identify. "What is it?" she asked, concern spiking through her chest. "It's from my lawyer," Dashiell said slowly, his voice strange. "About paperwork I filed months ago. Citizenship documents for Lyra's dual status since I was out of the country when she was conceived." He looked up at Isolde, and there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "They need us to come in tomorrow to review some discrepancies in the timeline. Some questions about the dates that don't quite match up with what I initially reported." He paused, seemed to struggle with what to say next. "Isolde, did you ever officially add me to Lyra's birth certificate? Because according to this, I'm not listed as her legal father, and there's some concern about retroactive paperwork that could complicate everything, including custody rights. if we're not careful about how we handle it." The words hung in the air between them, and Isolde felt her world tilt sideways for the second time in 18 months, felt all the peace she'd just been feeling evaporate like morning mist under harsh sunlight. "I didn't think about the birth certificate," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her mouth. "When you weren't there at the hospital, when I was alone, they just put my name, and then later when you came back into our lives, I assumed someone would handle it, that the lawyers would take care of it automatically when we got married." She looked at Dashiell with rising panic. "What does this mean? Can they take her away from you? From us?" "No," Dashiell said firmly, setting his phone down and taking both her hands. "Nothing like that. But we do need to handle it properly, get the paperwork corrected and filed correctly, establish legal paternity through the court system since it wasn't done at birth. It's just bureaucracy, Isolde. Annoying but fixable." But there was something in his voice that suggested it might be more complicated than he was letting on. Some concern he wasn't voicing, and Isolde felt the old anxiety clawing its way back up her throat. They went to the lawyer's office the next morning, Dashiell's sister watching Lyra at the apartment, and sat in leather chairs across from a man named Marcus Chen, who specialized in family law and looked far too young to be handling matters this important. He spread paperwork across his desk, forms and certificates, and legal documents that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to Isolde's anxious brain. "The issue," Marcus explained, his tone professional but not unkind, "is that we're trying to establish paternity retroactively, which requires either an acknowledgement of paternity form signed by both parents or a court order based on DNA testing. The acknowledgement form needs to have been filed within a certain time frame after birth, which has passed. So we're looking at the court route, which is straightforward but does require a hearing and a judge's approval." "A hearing?" Isolde's voice came out strangled. "Like in court? With questions about why he wasn't on the original birth certificate?" The implications were spinning out in her mind. Public record of her deception, official documentation of her lies, a legal proceeding that would require her to explain under oath why she'd kept Dashiell's name off their daughter's birth certificate in the first place. "Most likely, yes," Marcus confirmed. "The judge will want to understand the circumstances, ensure that establishing paternity is in the child's best interest, verify that there's no dispute about Mr. Proplamy Active N. Kavanaugh being the biological father." He paused, studying them both carefully. "Is there anything about your situation that might complicate this process? Anything the court might find concerning about the timeline or circumstances?" Isolde and Dashiell exchanged a look, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "Isolde was pregnant, but didn't tell me about it until she went into labor," Dashiell said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "I was out of the country on business, and she made the choice to handle the pregnancy alone. There was no abandonment, no dispute about paternity, just miscommunication and fear on both our parts about how to handle an unexpected pregnancy." Marcus made notes on his tablet, nodding slowly. "And you've since reconciled, obviously, given that you're married. The court will likely view that favorably. We'll see that you're both committed to co-parenting and have established a stable family unit." He looked up, met Isolde's eyes directly. "They may ask about your reasoning for not informing Mr. Kavanaugh initially. You'll need to be prepared to answer honestly, but without providing more detail than necessary. The focus should be on Lyra's best interest, which is clearly served by having both her parents legally established." They left the office an hour later with a court date scheduled for 3 weeks out and a stack of paperwork to complete, DNA testing to arrange even though there was no question about Dashiell's paternity, financial disclosures to prepare, because the court would want to ensure child support obligations were properly established, even though they were married, and those obligations were already being met. It felt invasive and humiliating and like punishment for choices Isolde had made when she was terrified and alone and convinced she was doing the right thing. "This is my fault," she said, as they walked back to their car. Autumn leaves crunching under their feet. The sky gray and heavy, with approaching rain. "If I'd just been honest from the beginning, if I'd put your name on the birth certificate at the hospital, we wouldn't be dealing with this now." "If you'd been honest from the beginning, we'd be dealing with different complications," Dashiell countered, stopping on the sidewalk and turning to face her. "Maybe I would have resented you for trapping me. Maybe he would have resented me for only being there out of obligation. Maybe we would have built a relationship on the wrong foundation, and it would have crumbled anyway. We can't know what would have happened in some alternate universe where you made different choices. We only know what's happening in this one, where yes, we're dealing with some annoying legal paperwork, but we're dealing with it together." His words made sense logically, but emotionally, Isolde felt like she was drowning. Like every choice she'd made during those 8 months of solitary pregnancy was coming back to haunt her. Like she'd never be able to fully escape the consequences of that original lie, no matter how much healing they'd done, no matter how strong their relationship had become. The court hearing felt like standing trial for her own fear, like having to justify choices that had made sense in the moment but looked indefensible in hindsight. The 3 weeks leading up to the hearing were tense, both of them trying to maintain normalcy for Lyra's sake. But the upcoming court date, hanging over them like a storm cloud that refused to break. They prepared for the questions they might be asked, practiced explaining their situation in ways that were honest but not unnecessarily damaging, tried to anticipate what a family court judge might want to know about two people who'd had a baby together before they'd sorted out their relationship. Isolde found herself spiraling at night, lying awake while Dashiell and Lyra slept, imagining worst-case scenarios where the judge decided their family was too unstable, where legal paternity was denied because of the complicated circumstances, where their past mistakes came back to destroy their present happiness. It was irrational. Marcus had assured them multiple times that this was routine paperwork more than anything else. But fear isn't logical, and Isolde's fear had deep roots that 18 months of healing hadn't quite managed to pull up. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear, one of those late autumn days where the air feels sharp enough to cut and the sky is blue enough to hurt. They dropped Lyra with Rue, who gave them both fierce hugs and told them to remember that they were fighting for their family, not against each other, and that no judge in their right mind would look at the two of them and see anything other than parents who desperately loved their daughter. The words helped a little, enough to get them into the car and to the courthouse without Isolde having a complete breakdown. The family courthouse was nothing like the imposing buildings you see in legal dramas, just a squat brick structure with fluorescent lighting and worn linoleum floors. The kind of place where hundreds of families every day came to sort out custody and support, and all the complicated legal issues that arise when relationships end or begin or transform into something unexpected. They sat on a bench outside the courtroom, Dashiell's hand holding hers so tightly she was losing circulation in her fingers, but she didn't pull away because the pressure was grounding, was keeping her tethered to reality when her mind wanted to spin out into panic. Kavanaugh family? A bailiff called their names, and they stood on legs that felt unsteady, followed him into a courtroom that was smaller and less intimidating than Isolde had feared. Just a raised bench where the judge would sit and a few rows of gallery seating and an American flag in the corner. Marcus was already there, sorting through files, and he gave them a reassuring nod as they took their seats at a table in front of the judge's bench. Judge Patricia Morrison entered from a side door, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. The kind of person who looked like she'd seen everything and wasn't easily shocked or impressed. She took her seat, reviewed the case file for a long moment, and then looked up at them with an expression that was professionally neutral but not unkind. "This is a petition to establish paternity for Lyra Brennan Kavanaugh," she began, her voice clear and measured. "Born prematurely at Meridian General Hospital 14 months ago, Mr. Kavanaugh, you're seeking to be legally recognized as the child's father, and Miss Brennan, now Mrs. Kavanaugh, you're consenting to this petition. Is that correct?" They both confirmed, and the judge made a note before continuing. "DNA testing has confirmed biological paternity with 99.9% certainty, so we're not here to dispute biology. What I need to understand is why Mr. Kavanaugh's name wasn't on the original birth certificate, and why we're establishing paternity through the court system 14 months after the child's birth." This was it, the moment Isolde had been dreading, where she'd have to explain the lie and hope that a stranger with the power to make legal decisions about her family would understand choices that she barely understood herself in hindsight. She felt Dashiell squeeze her hand under the table, a gesture of support and solidarity, and she took a breath that felt like it might be her last, and began to speak. "Your Honor, I was pregnant, but didn't inform Mr. Kavanaugh about the pregnancy. Because I was afraid, she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to be understood. He was out of the country on important business, and I convinced myself that telling him would derail his career and that our child would become an obligation he resented rather than a choice he embraced. When I went into premature labor at 32 weeks, I was alone, and Mr. Kavanaugh wasn't listed on the birth certificate because he didn't know he was a father. She paused, forced herself to continue. My friend contacted him during the emergency, and he arrived at the hospital during my labor. I told him the truth then, and he's been an active and devoted father ever since. The delay in establishing legal paternity was an oversight on our part, not intentional, and we're here now to correct that error. Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Isolde felt like she was being weighed and measured and found wanting. And Mr. Kavanaugh, you're saying you had no knowledge of the pregnancy until the day of the birth? The judge's tone wasn't accusatory, just clarifying, but the question still felt loaded with implications. That's correct, Your Honor. Daschle replied, his voice stronger than Isolde's, steadier. I was in Singapore, finalizing a business deal, and Mrs. Kavanaugh made the decision not to inform me because she was concerned about the impact on my career and our relationship. When I learned about Lyra's birth and that I was her father, I immediately took steps to be present and involved in her life. We've since married and established a stable home for our daughter. The judge made more notes, asked a few more questions about their living situation, about Daschle's involvement in Lyra's day-to-day care, about whether there were any custody disputes or concerns about either parent's fitness. Marcus provided documentation, character references from friends and family, photographs of them as a family, evidence of the life they'd built together over the past 14 months. It felt like having their entire relationship examined under a microscope, every choice scrutinized, every decision questioned. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Judge Morrison set down her pen and removed her reading glasses, looking at them both with an expression that had softened slightly. Let me be clear about something, she said, her tone firm but not harsh. The circumstances of this case are unusual. Most paternity petitions I see involve disputes, fathers trying to establish rights, or mothers seeking support from reluctant fathers. This case is the opposite. Two parents who are married and co-parenting successfully, but dealing with the legal consequences of choices made during a difficult time. She paused, seemed to gather her thoughts. Mrs. Kavanaugh, I understand that you made a choice you thought was right when you were scared and facing an unexpected pregnancy alone. I also understand that choice had consequences, including the legal complications we're dealing with now. However, from everything I've seen and heard today, it's clear that you and Mr. Kavanaugh have built a strong family unit and that establishing legal paternity is absolutely in Lyra's best interest. She deserves to have both her parents legally recognized, deserves the security and protections that come with that recognition. Isolde felt tears streaming down her face, relief so intense it was almost painful washing through her body. I'm granting this petition, Judge Morrison continued, signing a form with swift strokes of her pen. Mr. Kavanaugh, you are hereby legally recognized as Lyra Brennan Kavanaugh's father, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. A new birth certificate will be issued with both parents' names listed. Congratulations, and good luck to your family. They left the courthouse in a daze, the signed order in Marcus's briefcase, the weight of 14 months of incomplete paperwork finally lifted from their shoulders. In the parking lot, Isolde broke down completely, months of held anxiety pouring out in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Daschle held her, his own face wet with tears, and they stood there clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors who'd finally reached shore. It's done, he whispered into her hair. It's finally done. You're Lyra's mother, I'm Lyra's father, legally and officially and completely. No more loose ends. No more complications from the past coming back to haunt us. And standing there in that parking lot, with autumn leaves swirling around them and the sound of traffic, a distant hum, Isolde finally let herself believe it, let herself accept that maybe they really could move forward, that maybe the consequences of her lie had been faced and survived and they were still standing. The months that followed the court hearing felt different somehow, lighter, like they'd been carrying a weight neither of them had fully acknowledged until it was gone. Legally establishing Daschle's paternity had been more than just paperwork. It had been a final laying to rest of the past. A closing of the chapter that had begun with lies and fear and ended with truth and commitment, and a family built on solid ground instead of shifting sand. Lyra was growing impossibly fast, transforming from baby to toddler with the kind of speed that made time feel both infinite and desperately short. She was walking now, or more accurately running, careening around the apartment with joyful abandon and no sense of self-preservation, keeping both her parents in constant motion trying to prevent disasters. Her vocabulary was expanding daily, new words added to her repertoire with the kind of enthusiasm only toddlers possess, and she had opinions about everything from what she'd wear to what she'd eat to which bedtime story was acceptable on any given night. Watching Dashiell with their daughter never stopped filling Isolde with a complicated mix of emotions, joy and love, and lingering guilt that she'd kept them apart for those crucial first 8 months. He was patient and playful and completely present, got down on the floor to play blocks and tea party, did silly voices for bedtime stories that made Lyra shriek with laughter, handled toddler tantrums with calm that Isolde envied. He'd restructured his entire life around being the kind of father his own father had never been, had proven over and over that presence mattered more than success, that being there for your child was more important than any business deal or quarterly earnings report. Isolde's costume design business was flourishing, word of mouth bringing in more clients than she could handle, and she'd had to hire an assistant to help with the workload. She'd done the spring production at the Warehouse Theater where she'd first met Dashiell, coming full circle in a way that felt meaningful, and the show had been reviewed glowingly in local papers with specific praise for the costume design. Success tasted different now than she'd imagined it would when she was younger, felt less about recognition and more about the satisfaction of doing work she loved while building a life that had meaning beyond her career. They'd moved out of the apartment and into a house in Brooklyn with a yard where Lyra could play and a proper studio for Isolde's work and enough space for all three of them to breathe without constantly being on top of each other. The house was old and quirky, had strange angles and creaky floors and radiators that hissed and clanked, but it felt like home in a way no place Isolde had ever lived before had felt. They'd hosted Thanksgiving there, Dashiell's sister and Isolde's mother, and Rue and a handful of close friends crowding around a table that barely fit everyone. Lyra in her high chair throwing bits of turkey on the floor and laughing at the chaos she created. It was during cleanup after that Thanksgiving dinner, while Dashiell was putting Lyra to bed and Rue was drying dishes that Isolde had washed, that her mother pulled her aside in the kitchen. "You're happy," she said, and it wasn't quite a question, but wasn't quite a statement either. More like an observation that needed confirmation. "I am," Isolde admitted, feeling almost guilty for saying it out loud, like claiming happiness might jinx it somehow. Terrified half the time that I'll mess it up, but happy. "That's what being a parent is," her mother replied, reaching out to squeeze Isolde's shoulder. "Constant terror, mixed with overwhelming love, and the hope that you're doing it right, even though there's no manual, and every child is different, and you're making it up as you go along." She paused, her expression turning serious. "I was wrong to make you feel like following your father was the worst mistake I ever made. Yes, I gave up career opportunities and lost myself for a while, but I also got to experience things I never would have otherwise. The mistake wasn't following him, it was losing myself in the process, forgetting that I had value and dreams that mattered beyond supporting his. I spent so long being terrified of becoming you," Isolde whispered, the confession feeling dangerous but necessary. "Terrified that loving Dashiell meant giving up myself, that having Lyra meant becoming invisible the way you became invisible. But you didn't become me," her mother countered gently. "You learned from my mistakes without repeating them. You set boundaries, maintained your identity, built a partnership instead of a hierarchy. That's what I should have done, what I couldn't figure out how to do. You broke the pattern, sweetheart, and I'm so damn proud of you for that." The words were healing in a way Isolde hadn't expected. Permission she didn't know she needed to be happy without guilt, to build a life different from her mother's, without feeling like she was betraying the sacrifices her mother had made. Winter came with snow and short days and holidays that felt magical now that they had Lyra to experience them through. They took her to see Christmas lights that made her gasp with wonder, baked cookies that she helped decorate with more enthusiasm than skill, read her stories about reindeer and snowmen and the magic of giving. Dashiell surprised Isolde with a weekend away for their first anniversary, his sister watching Lyra, and they'd gone to a bed and breakfast in Vermont, where they'd slept for 12 uninterrupted hours and remembered what it felt like to be adults and partners, and not just mom and dad. It was on that trip, lying in bed with snow falling outside the window and Dashiell's arm around her, that Isolde finally asked the question that had been living in the back of her mind for months. Do you ever wish things had been different? That I'd told you from the beginning? That you'd been there for the pregnancy and the birth? That we'd done this whole thing in the right order instead of backwards? Dashiell was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. Sometimes, he admitted, I wish I'd gotten to feel her kick. Wish I'd been there for those first ultrasounds. Wish I'd been able to support you through the fear and the complications, instead of you having to face all of that alone. I wish I'd been there the moment she was born, instead of showing up after the fact. He shifted so he could look at her directly. But I can't wish away what happened without wishing away who we are now. The people we've become, the relationship we've built, it all came from surviving what happened. If you'd told me from the beginning, maybe we would have resented each other. Maybe I would have proposed out of obligation, and you would have accepted out of guilt. And maybe we would have built something that looked right from the outside, but felt wrong from the inside. He paused, traced patterns on her arm with his fingertips. I can regret what we both went through without regretting where it led us. Does that make sense? It did make sense, and it was the kind of nuanced perspective that Isolde was still learning to embrace, the ability to hold multiple truths at once without them canceling each other out. She could regret her choices and be grateful for the outcome. She could wish things had been different and accept that they couldn't be. She could acknowledge the pain while celebrating the healing. Spring came again, Lyra's second birthday approaching, and Isolde found herself thinking about the story they'd eventually tell their daughter about her beginning. They'd have to tell her someday, probably multiple times as she grew and was ready for different levels of detail, and the thought still terrified Isolde in quiet moments when she let herself think about it. What would Lyra think of her mother for lying? Would she understand the fear that had driven that choice, or would she just see abandonment and deception? Would she resent Isolde for keeping her from her father? Or would she appreciate the complicated love that had motivated every terrible decision? We'll tell her the truth, Dashiell said when Isolde voiced these fears late one night. Age-appropriate truth at first, more details as she gets older and can understand them. We'll tell her that Mommy made a choice she thought was right when she was scared. That Daddy wasn't there at first because he didn't know he was needed. That sometimes people make mistakes out of love, and what matters is how they fix those mistakes afterward. What if she hates me? Isolde whispered, the fear, finally given voice. What if she grows up and reads the magazine article or finds the court records and decides I'm a terrible person who kept her from her father? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Dashiell replied firmly. We'll give her the context, help her understand that people are complicated and choices aren't always clear-cut, and that you loved her enough to carry her alone for 8 months, even though it was terrifying. We'll show her through our actions every day that we're partners and that we're both committed to her. And we'll trust that the foundation we're building now will be strong enough to withstand whatever questions or anger she might have later. Lyra's second birthday party was held in their backyard on a perfect May afternoon, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that kept the air moving. They'd invited everyone who mattered, family and friends and theater people, and some of Dashiell's business colleagues who'd become friends over the past 2 years. Lyra wore a little pink dress that she'd insisted on picking out herself, her hair in pigtails that lasted approximately 20 minutes before she pulled them out, and she ran around the yard with the kind of manic energy that only toddlers can sustain. Watching her open presents with helping hands from adults, watching her blow out candles on a cake shaped like the starship from her favorite cartoon, watching her play with the other children who'd come to celebrate with her, Isolde felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 2 years. This was what she'd been trying to protect when she lied. This exact scenario, her daughter surrounded by love and laughter, and people who cared about her. She'd just been wrong about how to get here, had thought isolation and deception were the path, when really connection and truth had been the way all along. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, as Lyra fought sleep even though she was clearly exhausted, as Dashiell and Isolde stood together in their kitchen doing dishes and picking up wrapping paper and putting away leftover cake, Isolde found herself thinking about how far they'd come. 2 years ago, she'd been alone in a hospital room, terrified and convinced she was doing the right thing by keeping her pregnancy secret. Now she was in a house filled with evidence of family, married to a man who'd proven his commitment 1,000 times over, raising a daughter who was healthy and happy, and had no idea yet how complicated her beginning had been. "Thank you," she said to Dashiell as they finished cleaning up, as they stood together in the quiet house with Lyra asleep upstairs and the evening settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "For what?" he asked, pulling her close, his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "For showing up," Isolde replied, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "For forgiving me when I didn't deserve it. For proving every single day that love isn't about perfection, it's about choosing each other even when it's hard, even when mistakes have been made, even when the path forward isn't clear." "Thank you for letting me," Dashiell countered. "For being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it terrified you. For trusting me enough to build this life with me. For giving me Lyra and yourself, and a future I never knew I wanted until I almost lost it." They stayed like that for a long time, swaying slightly to music only they could hear, and Isolde thought about the story they'd eventually tell Lyra. The story of how Mommy lied because she was scared, and how Daddy showed up anyway, and how sometimes love means working through terrible mistakes and coming out stronger on the other side. It wasn't a perfect story, wasn't the fairy tale Isolde had once imagined, but it was real and honest, and theirs. The years that followed were marked by the ordinary milestones of family life. Lyra's first day of preschool that made both parents cry more than their daughter did. The addition of a dog named Cosmo, who Lyra loved with the fierce devotion only a child can have for a pet. Family vacations to the beach, where they built sandcastles and collected shells, and taught Lyra to swim. Isolde's business continued to grow, and she eventually opened a small storefront studio where she could work and teach classes and sell custom pieces. Dashiell's company thrived, but he maintained the boundaries he'd set, was home for dinner most nights, coached Lyra's youth soccer team, even though he knew nothing about soccer, showed up to every recital and school event and parent-teacher conference. They fought sometimes, normal couple arguments about whose turn it was to do school pickup or how much screen time was appropriate or whether they should have another baby, disagreements that felt massive in the moment, but were resolved with communication and compromise, and the understanding that being partners meant working through conflict rather than avoiding it. The foundation they'd built, truth and presence and chosen commitment, was strong enough to weather the storms that inevitably came with building a life together. It was when Lyra was 7, old enough to start asking more complicated questions about the world and her place in it, that she came home from school one day with a family tree assignment. She needed to fill in information about her parents and grandparents, needed to know dates and places and stories. And Isolde felt her heart start to race because she knew this was it, the conversation they'd been preparing for, the moment when they'd have to start explaining the complicated circumstances of Lyra's arrival. They sat down with her that evening after dinner, Dashiell on one side and Isolde on the other, and they began to tell her the story in terms a 7-year-old could understand. "When you were going to be born," Isolde began carefully, "Mommy was scared and made a choice that wasn't the best choice. I didn't tell Daddy that you were coming because I thought he was too busy with work and I didn't want to interrupt his important business. But that wasn't fair to Daddy," Dashiell continued, picking up the thread seamlessly, "because I would have wanted to know, would have wanted to be there for you and Mommy from the very beginning. I missed some really important parts of your story because Mommy didn't tell me, and that made me sad." "Are you still sad?" Lyra asked, her young face serious and concerned in that way children get when they're trying to understand grown-up emotions. "Sometimes I'm sad about what I missed," Dashiell admitted, "but I'm so happy about everything that came after. I'm happy that I got to be your dad, even if I didn't get to be there for every single moment. The important thing is that I'm here now, and I'm going to be here forever." "Why didn't you tell him, Mommy?" Lyra asked, turning to Isolde with a kind of direct question. Children are so good at asking, the kind that cut right to the heart of things adults want to avoid. Isolde took a breath, chose her words carefully. "I was afraid, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes because they're scared, just like kids do. I thought I was protecting Daddy and you by not telling him, but I was wrong. It would have been better to tell the truth and let us all work together from the beginning." But you told him eventually? Lyra pressed, trying to understand the timeline. I told him when you were being born, Isolde confirmed. I was at the hospital, and you were coming early, and I was so scared. My friend called Daddy, and he came right away. And when he saw you, he loved you so much. He's been the best daddy in the whole world ever since. They talked for a while longer, answering Lyra's questions as honestly as they could without overwhelming her with details she wasn't ready for. Watching her process the information with the remarkable resilience children have for accepting complicated truths. When she went to bed that night, she seemed satisfied with the answers she'd gotten, had filled in her family tree with dates and places, and moved on to the next homework assignment without apparent trauma. That went better than I expected, Dashiell said later, after Lyra was asleep, after they'd both spent an hour checking on her to make sure she really was okay with what they'd told her. She'll have more questions as she gets older, Isolde replied. But she felt lighter somehow, like they'd passed through another gate. Another milestone in the ongoing process of being honest about their past while building their future. She'll want to know more details, might get angry about the choices I made, might struggle with understanding why I did what I did. And we'll handle it when it happens, Dashiell said, pulling her close. Together, like we handle everything. And Isolde leaned into him, letting herself be held, letting herself believe that maybe they really would be okay. That maybe the foundation they'd built was strong enough to support whatever challenges came their way. Years continued to pass, Lyra growing from a curious 7-year-old into a thoughtful 10-year-old. Then a preteen with opinions about everything and the beginning of the independence that would eventually carry her into adulthood. She asked more questions about her origin story as she got older, wanted more details, processed the information through increasingly sophisticated lenses. There were moments of anger, times when she told Isolde it wasn't fair that she'd kept her from her dad, times when she needed Dashiell to reassure her that he'd forgiven Mommy, and she could too. But through it all, what Lyra saw every single day was two parents who loved each other and loved her, who were honest even when honesty was uncomfortable, who modeled what it looked like to make mistakes and work through them, to choose each other and their family above all else. She saw her father coach her soccer team even when he had important meetings, saw her mother build a successful business while still showing up for school events, saw them have disagreements and resolve them with communication and respect. The story that had started with lies and fear and a desperate attempt to protect everyone had transformed into something real and honest and solid, a family built not, despite its complicated beginning, but in many ways, because of it. They'd learned lessons about truth and vulnerability and presence that might not have been learned if everything had gone smoothly from the start. They'd built something stronger than they might have otherwise, because they'd had to fight for it, had to choose it deliberately rather than falling into it by default. And when Lyra was 15, old enough to read the magazine article from years ago, old enough to understand the full scope of what her mother had done and why, she came to Isolde with tears in her eyes and said, I read about how you lied to Dad. I read about the hospital and the emergency and all of it. Isolde's heart had stopped, waiting for anger or resentment, preparing to defend choices she'd long since accepted she couldn't fully defend. But instead, Lyra had hugged her fiercely and said, I'm sorry you were so scared. I'm sorry you felt like you had to go through that alone. And I'm so grateful that you told the truth when it mattered. That you let Dad in even though it was terrifying, that you built this family for me even when you were scared. And Isolde had broken down crying, had held her daughter who was almost as tall as she was now, had felt years of guilt and fear finally release their hold on her chest. I made so many mistakes, Isolde had whispered into Lyra's hair. But you fixed them, Lyra had replied, with the wisdom of someone who'd grown up watching her parents model what it looked like to work through difficulties. You chose truth over fear. That's what I'm going to remember, not the lie, but what came after. The lesson had taken 16 years to fully land, had required countless conversations and moments of vulnerability and the building of a family strong enough to survive its complicated beginning. But standing there in her kitchen with her teenage daughter in her arms and her husband walking in the door from work, Isolde finally understood what Dashiell had been trying to tell her all those years ago in the hospital. That love wasn't the burden. Fear was. And sometimes, the lies we tell to protect people are the very things that hurt them most. But more importantly, She'd learn that mistakes don't have to define you, that it's possible to build something beautiful from a flawed foundation if you're willing to do the work of honesty and presence and choosing love even when it's terrifying. She'd learned that showing up matters more than being perfect, that vulnerability is strength rather than weakness, that the truth might be painful in the moment, but it sets you free in ways that lies never can. She thought about the woman she'd been in that hospital room 16 years ago, alone and terrified and convinced she was doing the right thing. And she wanted to reach back through time and tell that woman that everything would be okay, that the truth would hurt but the healing would be worth it, that the man she was trying to protect would become her greatest partner, and that the daughter she was bringing into the world would be loved beyond measure by two parents who'd learned how to choose each other and their family above everything else. The story that had started with "I'm her emergency contact" had transformed into a lifetime of showing up, of being present, of building something real from the ruins of fear and deception. It wasn't a perfect story, wasn't the fairy tale Isolde had once imagined when she was young and naive about how love worked. But it was real and honest and theirs, and that made it better than any fairy tale could have been. As she stood in her kitchen with her family around her, with evidence of their life together in every corner of the house they'd built, Isolde whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force in the universe had brought Rue to call Dashiell that night, had brought him to the hospital when she needed him most, had given her the courage to tell the truth when it would have been easier to keep lying. And she promised herself that she'd keep choosing truth over fear, keep choosing presence over perfection, keep showing up for her family every single day for the rest of her life. Because in the end, that's what love actually was. Not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to acknowledge them. Not the avoidance of fear, but the courage to feel it and act anyway. Not the perfect beginning, but the deliberate choice to keep showing up and building something beautiful from whatever foundation you've been given, flawed as it might be. If this story reminded you that honesty takes more courage than silence, subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see love forever. And if you made it all the way here, tell us in the comments what lie you're holding that might actually be hurting more than helping, not to judge, but because your truth might be someone else's turning point. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we are and who we want to be. They hold up mirrors to our own choices and invite us to do better, to be braver, to choose truth over fear, even when every instinct tells us to protect ourselves with comfortable lies. Thank you for being here, for listening to Lyra and Dashiell and Isolde's story, for allowing their journey to maybe illuminate something in your own. And remember, showing up matters more than being perfect. Presence is the greatest gift we can give, and the truth might hurt for a moment, but lies hurt forever.